The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. There was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, how does this concern affect me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servers, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish ceremonial washings, each one holding 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus told them, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Draw some out now and take it to the head waiter." So they took it. And when the head waiter tasted the water that had become wine without knowing where it had come from, although the servers who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves good wine first, and then when people have drunk freely, an inferior one. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this as the beginning of his signs at Cana in Galilee, and so revealed his glory, and his disciples began to believe in him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Good morning once again. My name is Father Jim Quinlan. I was ordained almost 43 years ago in the Archdiocese of Chicago as a diocesan priest, and I ministered there for a little over 35 years before beginning my missionary work with Cross Catholic Outreach. It's probably an unfamiliar name to many of you unless you repeatedly watch EWTN, and of course on that channel you generally see the founder of our organization, a man by the name of Mr. Jim Kavner, often speaking about the work of the Mission Church as an invitation to the people of God to participate in the same work as well. During the past 8 years of my work with Cross, I've been privileged to visit many parts of the world, generally making an assessment about the missions we serve. We currently have missions in 44 countries around the world, places like Latin and Central America, the Caribbean islands, Asia, 11 countries in Africa, just to name a few. And in those 44 countries, there are currently 257 individual missions in those lands. And each one does something different. We make the assessment as to what they need after being contacted by the Vatican. We are the only United States Catholic charity that is directly affiliated with Cor Unum. If you know your Latin, it means one heart. And it's the Holy Father's personal charities to the poorest of the poor of the developing world. They would inform us that this missionary or this mission is worthy of our attention. We make an assessment then as to what they need. Is it food? Is it clean water? Housing, medicine, education? And we bring that message then to what we call the donor churches of the United States. Now, St. Monica has not been singled out as a donor parish. Every parish is, big and small, rich and poor, because of the precepts of the church. Now, if I were to ask you, for example, how many commandments there are, you should be able to tell me. You might not be able to get them in the right order. If I asked you how many sacraments there are, hopefully you'd be able to name all 7. But could we say how many precepts of the church there are? You might look them up. The 5th precept, though, speaks to us about our responsibility and our obligation to support our parish, to support our diocese, and also to support the work of the universal church. In a little while, we're going to stand and recite together the words to our creed. These words and similar words have what has been spoken for the past 1,700 years. In the year 325, the Emperor Constantine called all of the bishops, the known bishops of the world, to Constantinople in order to come up with a creed. They were actually fighting against a heresy called Arianism. But in that process, they decided to clearly state what the belief and what the faith is of those who called themselves followers of Christ. We've changed some of the words over the centuries, most recently with words like consubstantial, which most of us had never heard of before and needed some definition or recognition of that, but it simply means with the same substance: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, three persons, one God. But the words are basically the same. It is our faith. But oftentimes when we recite the creed, we race through it. We know it rotely, mechanically. We don't stop to think about the significance of how the church fathers came up with those words for our faith. The last paragraph is the one I'd like to refer to, in which it says, I believe in one holy Catholic, which means, by the way, universal, and apostolic church. Significantly, it says that we are the apostles of the next generation. Most of us are Catholic by accident of birth. Because our parents were baptized Catholics, they presented us to the church as infants and we had nothing to say about it. But every time we stand at Sunday Mass and recite the words of the creed, every time we walk into church and dip our hands into a holy water font, we should be reminding ourselves of the promises that were made at that time, even if we were too young to understand them. But now we're not. Now we should be able to say, yes, I do believe, and I also promise to live my faith, not just when it's convenient, but all the time. I mentioned last night at Mass that sometimes people only know that we're Catholic on Ash Wednesday, when we're walking around with ashes on our forehead. But what do they think of us the day after, or a month later, or a year later, when our actions or our words don't speak the fact that we are truly followers of Christ? What the creed and what our belief is should something that should be evident. They should see and know and love in us what they see and know and love in Jesus Christ. A little bit of background on myself. I was born on the west side of Chicago in 1944. So that means I'll be 75 years old this year. Hard to believe. In an instant, in the twinkling of an eye, we shall be changed. Well, I'm one of 10 children as well. I had 8 sisters and 1 brother. I introduced my 8 sisters at my 25th anniversary to the late Cardinal Francis George in Chicago. And after Mass and the luncheon that was held for my classmates, the Cardinal came over to my table, and after being introduced to the girls, he said to me, I can see that you are truly blessed among women. He was not a man known for his humor, but I have often treasured that particular line. Let me say something about our readings today. The first reading from the prophet Isaiah is powerful. It could almost be the same words that the man we honor tomorrow in a national holiday, Dr. Martin Luther King, would have spoken as well. I cannot be silent on Zion's sake. For the sake of others, I must speak out. And certainly Dr. King did that with his life, with his ministry, and eventually with the death that he suffered at the hands of an assassin. We gather tomorrow. Most of us don't think of the fact that this is the anniversary of his birth date and the things that he had accomplished during his short life. He's been dead now over 40 years, 4 decades since that's happened. He would have been a man in his mid-80s. But the legacy that he has left behind, because of his faith and his commitment to the people of God, not just to African American people, but to all of God's people, that there will one day be equality amongst all of us, that any ism that we might have is something that should be dissipated and erased. There's no isms except Catholicism in our life. And that's what we have to hold on to. Get rid of the things that are negative and keep us from being truly Christ baptized. The night before he died, He was speaking to a group of striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. And he wrote some beautiful words. He didn't write them, they were spoken by him, but they were taken down by others who were present. And I copied them out, and I thought it would be great to share it because they are pretty much the words that Isaiah speaks in the first reading as well. One of the constant themes of Dr. Martin Luther King was his phrase, "My strength is now from God alone." My strength is now from God alone. These are the words he spoke that evening. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know together that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. My God is my strength. The question that leaves us with, can we say as well that my God is now my strength alone? And if we can't say it, what do we do to assure the fact that it will be there at some point soon? Is it by our works of charity? Is it by our love for one another? Is it reaching out a hand to those who need our assistance? Whatever it may be, we can honestly say then that my God is now my strength. The second reading we heard was from St. Paul to the Christian community that he set up in Corinth. He wrote to them quite frequently and visited them several times as well. And the reason he wrote, there are two major letters, not written at one time, but little passages all put together. He wrote to them because they kept falling back into their old ways. And he wrote to encourage them. And this reading today that we heard speaks about the gifts that each of us have been given. No two of us have exactly the same gifts to share with others. God has bestowed on us through the Holy Spirit many different gifts, and we are expected then to share them. I worked for years for Marriage Encounter. They had a wonderful slogan that says, "Love isn't love until you give it away." The love in your heart isn't meant there to stay, nor is the gift of our faith meant there to just stay within us. It's meant to illumine and light the way for others as apostles to the next generation. And then we have the gospel, a very familiar story to us, probably most read at weddings, is the story of the very first miracle that Jesus performed, and it was at a wedding. How important must it have been for the Lord to wait until that wedding to perform his first miracle? How much he honored the sacrament of matrimony. I was privileged to be sitting in the church in Cana, where Jesus performed that miracle. It's a small little church in Israel. I sat there in the very front of the church all by myself for a long time. And I tried to think back during my almost 43 years of priesthood, how many marriages I performed and how many might still be together. We live in a very disposable society. We throw things away, including relationships. And I thought, could I have done more? Should I have done more? Should I have just not gone through the process, but really ensured the fact that what we were tying together sacramentally was indeed something that was going to endure through hard work? Certainly those of you who are married can recognize that, how difficult it is to submit yourself to someone else. And then, in a sense, to die to yourself in order to live for the other. It's a difficult path you've chosen. I couldn't choose it. I wasn't ready to, but I chose this path. Each of our vocations are great gifts from God, and this reading shows us that as well. Now to say more about Cross. As I said, I've been privileged to visit a number of missions around the world. When we're sent, we're not sent there necessarily to work in the missions, but to make an assessment about the missions that we do serve. And the assessment is, do we need to offer them more? Can we pull back somewhat? Or can we leave them on their own because of the self-help programs that we have always intentionally put into place? Because we try to fulfill the adage that if you give a man a fish, he's only going to eat for a day. But if you teach that man to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. I was sent to Haiti. I've been there 7 or 8 times now. I don't even remember exactly how many times. Usually after some devastating hurricane or the earthquake of 2010, where 200,000 people lost their lives within the first 2 days, and tens of thousands continued to die afterwards because of a curable disease called cholera. A container ship from Cross sailed from Florida to Hispaniola, to the side of the island that was so devastated, Haiti. And they sent, obviously, clean water, the pills that would cure cholera, as well as food. There was 1 million manna packs, they call them. They're about a 10-inch square cellophane package with proteins, nutrients, minerals, all of the things that would need to sustain life, because everything had been lost during that horrible earthquake of January 10th, 2010. We were feeding children one day in one of the orphanages that originally had been set up for 40 children. At this point, as a result of the earthquake, there were over 700 children. We were feeding them this manna pack. If you've seen some of the films of poor in Africa or other places of the world eating a sticky substance with their fingers, that's what the manna pack is, but it is a life-saving food. Well, most of the time I would notice outside the gates of that orphanage that children were standing there holding their hands out, hoping to receive some food, some nourishment for the day. Some of them carried broken bowls. Some had great big leaves, hoping to receive something for the day, the one meal a day that they would receive. Most of the time, we ran out. There was nothing left to give them. And I went to the director and I said, what do they do? How do they survive? What do they eat? He said, many don't survive. He said, but they have learned that if they literally pick up the clay of the earth, and if they moisten it a little, and then flatten it very thinly between their hands, he said, they will lay these cookies out in the hot Haitian sun. And later in the day, he said, they will eat these cookies. They have a name for them there. They call them bon bon terra, good earth, but there's nothing good about it. But the children have learned it will appease the pain of hunger in their stomachs. And we think we're hungry when we fast during the season of Lent. And how many times have we come home late from a dinner or a work and say, I'm starving? Do we really understand the significance of that, what that word means? I told that story in Virginia Beach maybe 6 months ago or so. And after Mass, a young family, a father and a mother and 2 young daughters, came up to me. And the dad pulled me literally out of listening distance of his children. He had tears streaming down his face, but with incredible pride in his voice, he said to me, my daughter has something that she would like to say, something that she would like to give you, Father. But I must tell you, it's her money. She's been saving her first communion money for something special for herself. So it came down to her level, and she handed me, all rolled up into a big ball, 2 $20 bills and a $10 bill. And she simply said, this is for the children who are forced to eat dirt. And I thought of what some woman once said to me many years ago. She said, we are responsible for what we know. And this child of 7 or 8 now felt the responsibility for what she knew, and she gave all that she had, $50, to feed the children who were forced to eat dirt. Before Mass began, I placed in every pew a brochure that looks like this. They're sitting at the very ends of each of your pews. I would ask those who are sitting at the end if they would kindly pass one further in so that we can all look at it for a moment simultaneously. I must say, though, right at the beginning, there is no second collection for Cross Catholic Outreach. It is a free will offering, so don't expect a second collection this evening, and we will talk more about that in a moment. I'd ask you to open it up to the very first page where it says, make an impact, on the inside of the brochure. It lists 5 things that we ordinarily take for granted in this land of plenty: food, clean water, housing, medicine, and education. But they are the basic 5 things that the poorest of the poor do not have the privilege of sharing. But we might be able to share some of our blessings with them. They're simply suggestions. The one I love at the end is housing. It says that for $2,500, we could build a house. Now, it wouldn't be your dream house or my dream house, but it certainly has become the dream house for many of the poorest of the poor. 2 weeks ago, I was also speaking in New Orleans, and a young mother with 2 young daughters who were probably in their maybe 10 or 11 years of age, she says, "My daughters say I have to buy 2 houses." And I said, "Well, that's wonderful, but how do they make that kind of a decision?" And she said, "Well, I'm going to honor it." And she gave me a check for $5,000 to build those 2 houses in the name of her children. Amazing things happen all over the world. There's a little graph here that shows that 95 cents out of every dollar that's raised goes where it's supposed to go. No overhead, just to those who call out to us for help. A little section here called prayer request, how important that is. Every morning from 8:30 to 9:30, the whole staff at Cross of around 60 people, many of whom are volunteers, gather each morning to pray for you. So if you have something to write down in that space for yourself or a loved one, include it. They will be praying for you, and their prayers are quite powerful. The brochure itself has a perforated line right in the middle, and it looks like 2 equal parts, almost. This part becomes a great big envelope, and we know what envelopes do. They hold things. So a little simple request that I'd like to make. I'd like you to do something that I personally did 13 years ago. I invited a Cross priest to my parish where I was pastor. I listened to what he had to say, was extremely impressed, but I had no money in my pocket. So I took the whole thing home, and I sat down and began to write a check. But as I'm writing, and I thought, if you can afford that this month, you can afford it next month as well, and the month after. I made the decision then to have an automatic withdrawal from my checking account, which can be done on the brochure or by phone or online. I can't say that I have missed that money in these past 13 years at all. And every time, because this part of the brochure is still in my refrigerator, reminding me that every time I open it up and share the bounty of God's blessings to me, that my money today might be saving a life. Please take one home. If God so inspires you to make a contribution, great. But maybe by having it at home, you might at least pray for the missionaries, the men and women who make the kingdom come for all of God's people every single day. Please keep them in your prayers. God bless you all.